In a quiet little town surrounded by green hills and peaceful streets, there lived a man named James Carter. He wasn't famous or rich, but he was someone who deserved respect. James was a decorated war veteran. For more than 20 years he had served his country with pride, wearing the uniform of a soldier and risking his life for others. His medals hung proudly on the walls of his modest home, shining reminders of battles fought and sacrifices made. But when James returned to civilian life after retiring from the military, he hoped for something simple: peace. He wanted to reconnect with his community, enjoy time with his family, and live without fear. Unfortunately, the world outside the battlefield wasn't always kind to James. Despite his service and dedication, he faced challenges that no amount of bravery could prepare him for. Racism lingered in corners where it shouldn't exist, hidden behind fake smiles and polite words. Some people treated him differently because of the color of his skin. It wasn't loud or obvious all the time, but it was there, a constant reminder that even heroes aren't immune to prejudice. One sunny afternoon, James decided to take a walk to clear his mind. The weather was perfect, with a gentle breeze rustling through the trees and birds chirping happily. He carried a small bag of groceries in one hand, feeling grateful for the calmness around him. As he strolled down the street, he noticed two police officers standing near their patrol car at the edge of the park. They were laughing loudly, their voices carrying across the otherwise serene atmosphere. At first, James paid them no attention. He simply kept walking, minding his own business. But then, as he passed by, one of the officers muttered something under his breath. Though James couldn't hear every word clearly, he caught enough to understand the tone. It was mocking and disrespectful. The officer's comment was about people like him, implying that James didn't belong in the neighborhood just because of how he looked. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He stopped for a moment, considering whether to confront them. But instead, he chose to keep moving. He told himself it wasn't worth it. Maybe they were having a bad day or were just ignorant. Either way, he didn't want trouble. As he continued walking, James tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over him. This wasn't the first time he'd heard such remarks. Over the years, he'd learned to ignore these kinds of comments. After all, what good would arguing do? Fighting back might make things worse, especially when dealing with people in positions of authority. Still, there was something about this encounter that bothered him deeply. Something about the way those officers laughed, the casual cruelty in their voices stuck with him long after he reached home. Later that evening, as James sat in his living room flipping through an old photo album, his thoughts drifted back to earlier that day. He remembered the faces of the officers, the smirk on one of their lips, the dismissive glance from the other. It made him angry, not just for himself, but for everyone else who might face similar treatment. How could men sworn to protect and serve behave so cruelly? Wasn't their job to uphold justice, not tear it down? The anger simmered inside him, mixing with frustration and sadness. James thought about his time in the military, the camaraderie he shared with fellow soldiers, and the values instilled in him during training. Respect, honor, discipline, these were principles he lived by. Yet here he was, being judged not for his character or actions, but for the color of his skin. It didn't seem fair. In fact, it felt like a betrayal of everything he'd fought for. Despite his growing unease, James pushed the thoughts aside for now. He reminded himself that dwelling on negativity wouldn't change anything. Instead, he focused on happier memories, the joy of coming home to his wife after deployment, the laughter of his grandchildren playing in the backyard. Life was too short to let bitterness consume him. Or so he thought. What James didn't realize was that this seemingly minor incident would soon spiral into something much bigger. Those officers may have thought they were untouchable, that their words and actions carried no consequences. But they had underestimated James Carter. They had chosen the wrong man to mock. And before long, they would learn exactly why messing with a veteran like James was a mistake they would regret. That night, as James lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he replayed the scene in his mind over and over again. Each time, the knot in his stomach tightened further. Sleep eluded him, replaced by restless thoughts and unanswered questions. Who gave those officers the right to treat him, and others like him, with such disdain? Why did racism persist, even in places where it should have no place? And most importantly, what could he do about it? By morning, James had reached a decision. Ignoring the situation wasn't an option anymore. He couldn't let this go unchallenged, not just for himself, but for everyone else who might feel powerless in the face of injustice. If those officers thought they could intimidate him, they were sorely mistaken. James Carter wasn't the kind of man to back down from a fight, not when it mattered. And this absolutely mattered. Little did those officers know their careless words had planted a seed of determination in James's heart, a seed that would grow into something far greater than they could imagine. The stage was set, and the battle, lines were drawn. What started as a single act of disrespect would soon become a turning point, not just for James, but for the entire community. The next day, James woke up with a heavy heart but a clear mind. He knew he couldn't let the previous day's incident slide. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. Sitting at his kitchen table, sipping a cup of coffee, he replayed the officers' mocking words in his head. Their laughter echoed in his ears like an unwelcome song, and their sneers lingered in his memory. James had faced danger on the battlefield, but this felt different. This was personal, and it stung. Later that evening, James decided to visit an old friend who lived on the other side of town. His friend Marcus was also a veteran, someone who understood the struggles of returning to civilian life. They often met to share stories, laugh about old times, and sometimes vent about the challenges they faced back home. As James drove through the quiet streets, he hoped tonight's conversation would help ease some of the tension building inside him. But fate had other plans. As James approached a stoplight near the edge of town, he noticed flashing blue lights behind him. His stomach sank as he glanced in the rearview mirror. A police car had pulled up close, its lights reflecting off the windows of nearby buildings. Confused, James slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run any red lights, and certainly hadn't done anything wrong. Still, he parked carefully, turned off the engine, and waited. When one of the officers stepped out of the patrol car, James immediately recognized him. It was one of the men from yesterday, the same man who had muttered those disrespectful comments. His partner joined him moments later, both walking toward James's vehicle with an air of arrogance. James's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, but he forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help. He needed to think clearly. The first officer leaned into the driver's window, his expression smug. "Do you know why we stopped you?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. James shook his head. "No, sir, I don't." The officer smirked, glancing at his partner before turning back to James. "Speeding," he said flatly. "We clocked you going 20 miles over the limit." James blinked in disbelief. "That's not possible," he replied firmly. "I've been driving under the speed limit this whole time." "Oh, really?" the officer shot back, raising an eyebrow. "So you're calling us liars now?" "No, I'm just saying—" "Save it," the second officer interrupted, stepping closer. "You veterans always think you're above the rules, don't you? All talk and no action." James felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he swallowed it down. He reminded himself that arguing wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he reached into his glove compartment and pulled out his license and registration, handing them over, politely. On top of the papers was a small card identifying him as a retired military veteran, a reminder perhaps of the respect he deserved. Instead of acknowledging it, the first officer snatched the documents from James's hand, crumpling them slightly before tossing them onto the dashboard. "We'll see how much your veteran status helps you here," he muttered sarcastically. The insult hit James like a punch to the gut. These men weren't just accusing him of something he hadn't done. They were mocking him for serving his country. For years he had risked his life to protect people like them, and now they treated him like a criminal. The injustice burned inside him, threatening to boil over. For several minutes, The officers continued to belittle James, making snide remarks about his appearance, his car, and even his choice of friends. They questioned whether he was involved in illegal activities, implying that someone like him couldn't possibly have honest intentions. Each word was laced with disdain, each glance filled with contempt. It wasn't just a routine traffic stop. It was a deliberate act of humiliation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officers handed James a ticket for an offense he hadn't committed. One of them leaned close to the window, his voice low and menacing. "Maybe next time you'll think twice about walking around here," he whispered, his eyes narrowing. "Or driving. Or breathing." The threat hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. James stared straight ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. Inside, however, his emotions were a storm. Anger, frustration, and sadness swirled together, creating a whirlwind of conflicting feelings. He wanted to scream, to demand justice, to remind them that he was more than just the color of his skin, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded stiffly, waited for them to leave, and then drove away. On the ride home, James's mind raced. How could this happen? How could people entrusted with protecting citizens behave so cruelly? Every mile seemed heavier than the last, weighed down by the weight of what had just occurred. By the time he reached his driveway, he felt exhausted. Not physically, but emotionally. He sat in his car for a while, staring blankly at the steering wheel, trying to process everything. Back inside the house, James paced the living room, replaying the events in his mind. He thought about the officers' smirks, their mocking tones, their cruel words. He thought about the ticket they'd given him, knowing full well it was undeserved. Most of all, he thought about the underlying message behind their actions. You don't belong here. You're less than us. But as angry as James was, another emotion began to emerge. Determination. If these men thought they could break him, they had chosen the wrong person. James Carter wasn't the kind of man to sit back and accept injustice. He had fought wars, survived battles, and overcome countless obstacles. This was just another challenge, albeit a deeply personal one, and he wasn't going to back down. That night, James made a decision. He grabbed a notebook and began jotting down notes about the encounter, every detail he could remember, from the officers' badge numbers to the exact words they had used. He wrote down the location, the time, and the circumstances surrounding the stop. He even sketched a rough map of where it had happened, marking the positions of the vehicles and the officers. Documentation, he realized, would be key. Once he finished writing, James opened his laptop and started researching. He looked up local laws regarding racial profiling, searched for organizations that supported victims of police misconduct, and read articles about similar cases. The more he learned, the clearer his path became. This wasn't just about him. It was about exposing a larger issue. It was about holding those officers accountable and ensuring that no one else had to endure what he had gone through. By morning, James had a plan. He reached out to Marcus, explaining everything that had happened. To his relief, Marcus was supportive, offering advice and encouragement. "You're not alone in this," Marcus told him. "There are others who face the same thing. Let's stand together." Over the next few days, James connected with fellow veterans and community members who shared his outrage. Together, they formed a coalition aimed at fighting systemic racism and police brutality. They organized meetings, brainstormed strategies, and prepared to take action. What started as a single act of discrimination quickly grew into something much bigger, a movement fueled by courage and resilience. Though the road ahead promised to be difficult, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. Those officers may have underestimated him, but they had made a grave mistake. They had chosen the wrong man to mock. And soon enough they would learn exactly why messing with James Carter was a decision they would regret. James's resolve hardened with each passing day. The memory of the officers' smirks, their cruel words, and the thinly veiled threat still lingered in his mind. But it no longer paralyzed him. Instead, it fueled a fire within, a determination to fight back not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unjustly because of the color of their skin. He knew this wouldn't be easy. Taking on corrupt authority figures was never simple, especially in a small town where power dynamics often favored those in uniform. But James wasn't afraid of challenges. After all, he had faced far worse. On the battlefield, the first step was gathering evidence. James understood that proving racial profiling and misconduct wouldn't be enough without solid documentation. So, every evening after work, he sat at his kitchen table poring over notes, organizing details and building a timeline of events. He included everything: the initial encounter near the park, the traffic stop, the mocking comments, and even the crumpled registration papers tossed onto his dashboard. No detail was too small. He wanted to leave no room for doubt when the time came to present his case. Next, James reached out to legal experts and advocacy groups specializing in police accountability. One organization, called Justice for All Veterans, offered immediate support. Their representatives guided James through the process of filing formal complaints against the officers involved. They explained how to request dashcam footage from the patrol car and advised him to write down the names of any witnesses who might have seen the incident. "You're not alone in this," one of the advocates assured him. "We've seen cases like yours before and we know how to handle them." Encouraged by their guidance, James submitted a complaint to both the local police department and higher authorities. He attached copies of his notes, photos of the ticket he'd been issued, and a letter detailing his experience. In the letter, he wrote passionately about the impact of racism, not only on individuals, but on entire communities. He highlighted his years of service to the country, emphasizing that veterans deserved respect, not mockery or mistreatment. By the time he mailed the envelope, James felt a flicker of hope. This was just the beginning, but it was a start. Meanwhile, James turned to social media to share his story. At first, he hesitated. Publicly speaking out meant opening himself up to scrutiny, criticism, and possibly retaliation. But then he remembered something Marcus had said during one of their meetings. "If you don't speak up, who will?" With that thought in mind, James created a post describing what had happened. He included screenshots of the complaint he'd filed and asked others to share his story if they believed in justice. Within hours, the post went viral. People from across the country began commenting, sharing, and reposting. Some expressed outrage over the officer's behavior, while others shared their own experiences of discrimination at the hands of law enforcement. A few veterans even reached out directly to James, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. "Thank you for standing up," one message read. "Your courage gives us strength." As the online movement gained momentum, local news outlets took notice. Reporters contacted James asking for interviews and more information about his case. At first, he was hesitant to talk to the press. After all, he didn't want to become the center of attention. But then he realized this was an opportunity to shine a light on systemic issues that needed addressing. So he agreed to sit down with a journalist from the town's newspaper. During the interview, James spoke calmly but firmly, recounting the events of the traffic stop and explaining why he felt compelled to take action. His words resonated deeply, capturing the hearts of readers nationwide. The backlash was swift. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice for James Carter," and "End Police Racism." Supporters organized fundraisers to cover legal fees for James and others affected by discriminatory policing. Community leaders demanded answers, calling for transparency and accountability. The pressure mounted, forcing officials to launch an internal investigation into the officer's conduct. But James didn't stop there. He attended city council meetings, using his platform to advocate for broader reforms. Standing before rows of concerned citizens, he delivered powerful speeches about the need for change. His voice carried weight, not just because of his eloquence, but because of his authenticity. Here was a man who had sacrificed so much for his country, yet faced oppression in his own backyard. People listened, and slowly but surely progress began to take shape. One particularly memorable meeting stands out. It was late in the evening, and the room buzzed with tension. Dozens of residents had shown up to voice their concerns, many holding candles in silent protest. When James stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent. He began by thanking everyone for coming, acknowledging the bravery it took to stand together against injustice. Then he launched into his speech. "I didn't ask for this fight," James said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Nobody asked to be treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. But here we are, forced to confront a reality that shouldn't exist in the first place. These officers, they mocked me, they belittled me, they made me feel like I didn't matter. But let me tell you something, I do matter, and so does every single person sitting in this room tonight." His words struck a chord. Applause erupted, echoing through the chamber. For the first time in weeks, James felt a sense of unity, a shared purpose binding him to the community. Together, they were stronger than any obstacle. Behind the scenes, James worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going. He collaborated with lawyers to draft petitions demanding stricter oversight of police departments. He partnered with educators to create workshops on racial sensitivity training. He even started mentoring young people in the neighborhood, teaching them about leadership and resilience. Through it all, he remained humble, reminding himself that this movement wasn't about him. It was about creating a better future for everyone. Still, the journey wasn't without its challenges. Some critics dismissed James's efforts as unnecessary drama, accusing him of exaggerating the situation. Others claimed he was seeking attention or trying to tarnish the reputation of law enforcement. But James refused to let negativity derail him. He responded to criticism with grace, always steering conversations back to the bigger picture: fairness, equality, and justice. By the end of the month, the investigation yielded preliminary results. Both officers involved in James's harassment were placed on administrative leave pending further review. Several other officers implicated in similar cases faced disciplinary action as well. While the road to true justice remained long, these developments marked a significant victory, a testament to the power of perseverance and unity. For James, the experience transformed him in ways he never anticipated. Once content to live quietly, he now dedicated himself to advocacy work. He traveled across the country, speaking at conferences and rallies about racial injustice and police reform. His story inspired countless others to stand up against prejudice, proving that courage can spark meaningful change. Though scars remained, both emotional and societal, James found solace in knowing he'd fought back. Those officers may have underestimated him, but they had chosen the wrong man, and in doing so they ignited a fire that refused to be extinguished. The momentum James had built was unstoppable. What started as a personal fight against injustice had grown into something much larger, a movement fueled by resilience, courage, and unity. James knew that exposing corruption and racism within the police department wouldn't be easy, but he also understood the importance of strategy. Every step he took was calculated, every decision made with purpose. He wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for an entire community. With the help of Justice for All veterans and other advocacy groups, James filed formal complaints not only against the two officers who had harassed him, but also against the broader system that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. His legal team submitted requests for dashcam footage from the patrol car involved in his traffic stop. They demanded transparency, knowing full well that evidence would either vindicate James or further expose the misconduct of the officers. Meanwhile, the public outcry continued to grow. Protesters gathered daily outside the police station, holding signs and chanting slogans like "Accountability now" and "No justice, no peace." Local businesses showed their support by donating food and water to the demonstrators. Even schools got involved, organizing teach-ins about systemic racism and encouraging students to write letters to city officials demanding change. The town, once known for its quiet streets and sleepy atmosphere, had become a hub of activism and awareness. James played a central role in keeping the movement alive. He attended nearly every protest, standing shoulder to shoulder with supporters. His presence inspired others to speak out, reminding them that even one voice could make a difference. At rallies, he shared his story again and again, emphasizing the importance of persistence. "We can't give up," he told the crowd during one particularly fiery speech. "If we stop fighting, they win, and I didn't survive wars overseas just to lose here at home." Social media remained a powerful tool in spreading James's message. Supporters created hashtags like Dang Stand with James and Tiang Justice for Veterans, which trended nationwide. Celebrities and influencers began sharing his story, amplifying his call for reform. News outlets picked up on the growing movement, shining a spotlight on systemic racism within law enforcement. Reporters interviewed victims of similar incidents, highlighting patterns of discrimination that stretched far beyond James's small town. As pressure mounted, local authorities had no choice but to act. An independent review board was established to investigate allegations of misconduct within the police department. This board consisted of community leaders, civil rights advocates, and retired law enforcement officials, all committed to uncovering the truth. James testified before the board, recounting his experience in detail. His testimony was calm, yet firm, leaving no room for doubt about what had happened. But James didn't rely solely on official channels. He worked tirelessly behind the scenes, connecting with other veterans who had faced similar treatment. Together, they formed a coalition called Veterans Against Injustice, VAI. The group's mission was simple: to hold law enforcement accountable while advocating for policies that promoted fairness and equality. VAI organized workshops, hosted panel discussions, and collaborated with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at preventing racial profiling. One of their most impactful initiatives was a series of community forums where residents could share their experiences with police misconduct. These forums provided a safe space for people to speak openly without fear of retaliation. Stories poured in, some heartbreaking, others infuriating, but all underscored the urgent need for reform. Hearing these accounts strengthened James's resolve. He realized that his case was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Despite the progress, resistance remained. Some members of the police department pushed back against the investigation, claiming it was unnecessary or politically motivated. A few outspoken critics accused James of exaggerating his story, dismissing the movement as nothing more than a witch hunt. But James refused to let negativity derail him. Instead, he responded with facts and determination, always steering conversations back to the bigger picture. Justice. His efforts paid off. After months of scrutiny, the Independent Review Board released its findings. The report confirmed what James and countless others already knew. Systemic racism existed within the police department. It highlighted instances of racial profiling, excessive use of force, and discriminatory practices. Both officers involved in James's harassment were suspended indefinitely, pending potential criminal charges. Several other officers implicated in similar cases faced disciplinary action as well. While the results were significant, James knew this was only the beginning. True reform required more than suspensions and investigations. It required structural changes. So he turned his attention to policy advocacy. Working closely with lawmakers, James helped draft a bill aimed at increasing accountability within law enforcement agencies. The bill included measures such as mandatory body cameras, stricter penalties for misconduct, and regular anti-bias training for officers. When it was introduced in the state legislature, hundreds of supporters packed the hearing room, cheering, as James delivered a passionate speech in favor of the proposed reforms. "We're not asking for special treatment," James said, addressing the lawmakers. "We're asking for fairness, for transparency, for respect. These are basic human rights, yet they're denied to so many people simply because of the color of their skin. It's time to change that." The bill passed unanimously, marking a historic victory for James and his coalition. Celebrations erupted across the town, with people hugging, crying, and cheering in the streets. For the first time in years, there was hope, a belief that real change was possible. But James didn't rest on his laurels. He knew the fight wasn't over. Racism and prejudice weren't problems that could be solved overnight. They required constant vigilance and effort. So he continued working tirelessly, traveling to neighboring towns and cities to share his story and inspire others to take action. Wherever he went, he carried the same message. Don't wait for someone else to fix things. Be the change you want to see. By now, James had become a symbol of resilience, a living testament to the power of perseverance. People looked up to him not because he was perfect, but because he was human. He had faced hatred and humiliation, yet he chose to respond with strength and grace. That's what made him extraordinary. As the weeks turned into months, James reflected on how far he'd come. From that initial traffic stop to the sweeping reforms now taking shape, his journey had been anything but easy. There were moments when he doubted himself, when the weight of the world felt too heavy to bear. But through it all, he never gave up. And in doing so, he proved that even the smallest spark could ignite a fire capable of burning down walls of injustice. Little did those officers know, their careless words had planted a seed of determination in James's heart. A seed that grew into something far greater than they could have imagined. What started as a single act of disrespect had blossomed into a movement, a beacon of hope, for communities everywhere. Those officers may have thought they were untouchable, but they had chosen the wrong man to mock, and in doing so, they ignited a fire that refused to be extinguished. Months had passed since James Carter first stood up to the officers who mocked and humiliated him. What began as a personal struggle against injustice had evolved into a nationwide movement, inspiring countless others to demand accountability and reform. The journey hadn't been easy. There were sleepless nights, moments of doubt, and battles fought on multiple fronts. But James never wavered. He knew that true justice wasn't just about punishing those who had wronged him. It was about creating lasting change that would benefit future generations. The Independent Review Board's findings sent shockwaves through the town. Both officers involved in James's harassment were suspended indefinitely, pending further investigation. One of them faced criminal charges for falsifying reports and tampering with evidence during the traffic stop. Several other officers implicated in similar cases were also held accountable, some losing their jobs while others underwent mandatory retraining programs. While these actions didn't erase the harm caused, they signaled a shift, a recognition that systemic racism couldn't be ignored any longer. For James, this victory was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt vindicated. His voice, once dismissed as unimportant, had sparked meaningful change, but on the other hand, he couldn't help but think about all the people who hadn't been as fortunate. How many others had suffered in silence, too afraid or powerless to speak out? The thought weighed heavily on him, reminding him that his work was far from over. Determined to keep the momentum going, James threw himself into advocacy work. He traveled across the country, speaking at conferences, rallies, and community meetings. His speeches were always heartfelt and raw, drawing from his own experiences to highlight the urgent need for reform. "I didn't fight wars overseas just to come home and face oppression here," he often said. "If we want real justice, we have to stand together, not just for ourselves but for everyone who feels voiceless." His message resonated deeply. People listened, not because James was famous, but because he spoke with authenticity. Here was a man who had sacrificed so much for his country, yet returned to find prejudice waiting for him. His story inspired veterans, activists, and ordinary citizens alike to join the fight for equality. Social media played a crucial role in spreading his message, with hashtags like Stand with James and Justice for All trending regularly. Supporters organized fundraisers, awareness campaigns, and even art exhibits dedicated to amplifying marginalized voices. One particularly memorable event took place in Washington, D.C., where James addressed a massive crowd at a national rally for police reform. Standing on stage beneath a sea of banners and cheering faces, he delivered a speech that brought tears to many eyes. "When I came home from serving my country, I expected respect," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Instead, I got hatred. Hatred not because of what I did, but because of who I am. That's not freedom. That's not justice. And until every person, no matter their race, gender, or background, is treated equally, none of us are truly free. The applause was thunderous, echoing through the streets of the nation's capital. For James, it was a moment of validation, a reminder that his efforts weren't in vain. But more importantly, it reinforced his belief in the power of unity. Change couldn't happen alone. It required collective action. And James was proud to see so many people standing shoulder to shoulder, united in their pursuit of a better world. Back home, the impact of James's advocacy continued to ripple through the community. The bill he helped draft, the one aimed at increasing police accountability, was signed into law by the governor. Mandatory body cameras became standard equipment for all officers, and stricter penalties were introduced for misconduct. Anti-bias. Training sessions were implemented not only for law enforcement, but also for teachers, healthcare workers, and government employees. These measures weren't perfect solutions, but they represented progress, a step toward dismantling the systems that perpetuated inequality. James also focused on mentoring young people in the neighborhood, teaching them about leadership, resilience, and the importance of using their voices for good. He believed strongly in empowering the next generation, knowing they would inherit the responsibility of continuing the fight. "You don't have to wait until you're older to make a difference," he told a group of high school students during one workshop. "Every act of kindness, every word of encouragement, every refusal to accept injustice, it all matters. Be brave, be bold, and never let anyone tell you your voice doesn't count." As time went on, James found solace in the friendships and connections he'd formed along the way. Marcus, his old friend and fellow veteran, remained a steadfast supporter, often accompanying James to events and offering advice when needed. Together, they laughed about old times, shared stories of their military days, and dreamed about the future. Other members of Veterans Against Injustice, VAI, became like family, working tirelessly alongside James to push for reforms. Still, scars remained. The memory of that fateful traffic stop lingered in James's mind, a painful reminder of the challenges he'd faced. Some nights he lay awake replaying the officers' mocking words, their smirks, and the disdain in their eyes. But instead of letting bitterness consume him, James channeled those emotions into fuel for his mission. He reminded himself that anger, when harnessed correctly, could drive positive change. It was a lesson he carried with him every day. By the end of the year, James's story had reached international audiences. News outlets around the world covered his journey, highlighting his courage and determination. Documentaries were made, books were written, and awards were given, but none of that mattered to James. For him, the true reward was seeing communities come together, united by a shared vision of justice and equality. One evening, as James sat on his porch watching the sunset, he reflected on how far he'd come. From that initial encounter near the park to the sweeping reforms now taking shape, his life had transformed in ways he never imagined. He thought about the sacrifices he'd made in the military, the years spent away from loved ones, and the friends lost in battle. Had it all been worth it? Yes, he decided, because despite the challenges, he had seen glimpses of hope, proof that humanity could rise above hatred and division. In the distance, laughter echoed from the park where children played under the fading light. James smiled softly, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. This was why he fought, for moments like these where innocence and joy thrived without fear. Though scars remained, both emotional and societal, he knew the future held promise. Change wasn't instantaneous, but it was happening. Slowly but surely, walls were crumbling, barriers were breaking, and bridges were being built. Those officers may have thought they were untouchable, but they had chosen the wrong man to mock. They underestimated James Carter, a man of honor, discipline, and unwavering resolve. And in doing so, they ignited a fire that refused to be extinguished. A fire that burned brightly, illuminating the path toward justice for all.